all for joining us. We have been doing a lot of online programming. We're going to continue doing that through the summer, so stay tuned for our upcoming events. Next week, we plan on doing a part 3 of our government town hall series. We're finalizing the details for that, and then we're continuing with webinars throughout the month of July. So stay tuned. And with that, I will turn everything over to John Gay. He is the owner, proprietor, CEO of Jag in Detroit Podcast, and he's an expert in his field. And we are thankful that he is a chamber member and glad to have him on board doing this webinar for us. So John, if you'd like to go ahead and get started. I would like to say if we have questions, you can always, wave, raise your hand, signal through the app, or type it in the chat bar, and then we will leave time for questions at the end as well. So, all right, to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it. Thank you for everybody for joining this morning. As Kelly said, my name is John Gay, founder and CEO of Jag in Detroit Podcasts. My background is that I was a radio DJ for 15 years prior to getting into podcasting 2 years ago. Locally worked at Channel 955 and 98.7 AMP Radio. Kind of saw radio on the downtick and podcasting on the uptick, so I started my own company 2 years ago. Let me share my screen and we'll make sure that everybody can see it. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Excellent. It works. Yay. Okay. So I'm going to kind of cover a lot of things with regard to podcasting. I'll take some questions at the end and we'll kind of go from there. So with that, this is kind of be a basic overview of podcasting. So what is a podcast? A lot of people have heard of it. It is a portable piece of audio that can be, let me back up, that can be listened to on demand or downloaded for later listening on any internet-connected device, computer, phone, etc. And why are they growing? Well, they're growing fast for a couple of reasons. A lot of buzz around online video, but audio goes where video can't. On a run, in your car, in the office. I always tell potential clients, you can't watch a YouTube video while you're driving, or at least you really shouldn't. So audio can go where video can't. And especially now in the last few months in this time of social distancing, we've all been craving content. And as a podcast, you've got a captive audience. People are at home consuming your content. Some of the stats I'm going to give you are released around March or so. So it's BC, as I like to say, before Corona. So just a quick, I added this slide in here. The creation of podcasts are really growing quickly because everybody's at home. Apple, which is by far and away the dominant medium when it comes to podcasting, 90,000 new podcasts in just last month were created because people are at home and they're creating podcasts. And as far as listening goes, there was kind of an initial scattering. The best analogy I've heard is it's like somebody fired a gun up into the air in a grocery store and everybody ran, and then they realized, oh, I still need milk and bread and eggs, and eventually came back. So once people kind of got into their COVID routines, figured out what things were like, they started to listen to podcasts again, come back to the shows that they were listening to before. Also, with the world starting to open back up, people are in their cars again, things like that. Some of the stuff has shifted. There's more listening on desktop now because people are home and they're on their computers all day. Sometimes listening has shifted to later in the day after the kids are done with their virtual school or going to bed, as opposed to listening in the car on the way to work in the morning or in the afternoon. So I'm going to run through a bunch of slides with some stats on here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but this is sort of just a general overview. This is the from the Edison Research's Infinite Dial study that comes out every year. Some of this data is from the 2019, some from 2020. And this is among U.S. population age 12 and up. So U.S. adults, they consider age 12 and up. So if you look at household income above $75,000, overall, that is 29% of the population. It is 41% of podcasters. So a reason a lot of people get into podcasting is the audience is a lot, generally speaking, a lot more wealthy than the general population. Same thing with education. As you can see on the right, the blue goes up as education goes up. Generally speaking, podcast listeners are slightly more educated than the general population. So they make more money, they're better educated. That's 18 plus, because we talked about college here. This is the really big number for me, and this is podcasting familiarity. 75%, 212 million people. This is as of March of this year. 3/4 of Americans age 12 and up are at least familiar with the term podcasting. That's how much it's grown. 3 out of every 4 people at least have some familiarity with the medium. As far as actual listeners that have ever listened, last year we crossed halfway. We're now up to 55% of Americans 12 and up have at least listened to a podcast at some point. That's 155 million American adults. Monthly, 104 million. So 37% are listening to a podcast at least monthly. And 1 in 4 are listening at least weekly. That's 68 million people. Of those people in the last slide, on average, they're spending a little more than 6.5 hours a week listening to podcasts. They're spending a lot of time with podcasts, generally 6 or 7 a week. It's a pretty compelling medium. This is a common misconception that I want to clear up. A lot of people freak out in podcasting. How do I get to the top of Apple charts? Please leave a 5-star review. Please comment and tell me how great my podcast is. Some people do find podcasts by looking through Apple's top charts, but really people are Googling their way to podcasts. They're finding internet searches, and they're also relying on new school word of mouth, meaning social media, and old school word of mouth, meaning recommendations from friends and family. Those are the top ones on here. Is somebody says, oh, hey, I heard this great podcast. If you're into fantasy football, this is a great podcast for you to listen to. A lot of it comes from recommendations and seeing what people are sharing on social media. So it's a bit of a misconception that getting the charts is the only way to go. Podcast audience is about quality, not quantity. People worry about CPM. Anybody who's done internet marketing worries about cost per 1,000 views. But really, click here. If you're listening to a podcast, you're spending a lot more of your attention than you would liking a cat video on Instagram. Your podcast audience is more engaged. They are more compelled. And I'd rather have 10 very interested podcast listeners than 100 people like a post on Facebook. There's a lot more value in the metrics here for podcast listeners because it's a lot more of an engaged audience than somebody who just passively clicks something on social media. Who, what, when, where, why, how? How you get on the podcast apps. And the big 3 are Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Those are the top 3. Everybody else is distantly after that. So Apple is still king, followed by Spotify, and Google Podcasts has now finally gotten involved and started to make headway too. But Apple and Spotify are by far the big 2. You may have heard in the last month or so that Joe Rogan, who's the biggest podcaster out there, just got $100 million to bring his podcast exclusively to Spotify. So there's some serious money there. Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google are the big 3. How people listen to podcasts? Excuse is a little squashed down a little bit. These are 2 podcasts that I'm involved with, my own show, the Jag Show podcast, and then a partnership I'm involved with called Michigan Motors Forward, featuring people in Michigan who have done great things in the wake of COVID-19. You can embed a podcast player right on your website where people can listen to every episode. That says Mistress Carrie. She's a radio DJ turned podcaster. She was my latest episode. So you can put a player that's going to show all your episodes right on your website. If somebody is not tech savvy, doesn't understand how an app works, and wants to listen to your content, you can embed it right on your website. People can just go to your website and click play. That's a screenshot from my website. So you can embed a player on your website. You can also put a link in your social media or eBlast, and that link can take you to a page like this, which is either the full show, and you can see how you can listen to all the episodes down here, or a little pop-up will let you listen on your favorite app if you were to open this page on your phone or your tablet. So you can link to the full show, or you can link to a specific episode. This is an episode we did with Mark Bernstein for the Michigan Motors Forward podcast. Again, you can just send that link in your eBlast, post it on your social media, get your content out that way. Why are you doing the podcast is really important. Is it a vanity project? Is it a marketing tool for your business? Is it a resource? And most importantly, why am I passionate about this subject matter? If you're doing a podcast to check the box, people will see right through it. Their BS meters are finely tuned. So if you are not passionate about what you're talking about, the show won't be good. It's got to be something you've got real interest in. 3 examples of shows I've worked on. Spiro Avenue. Justin Spiro is a sports fan who likes to have a sports talk podcast. He does it in his basement. I've worked with him. He just enjoys doing it. He would admit it's a vanity project. Marrow Masters is a partnership I've done with the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link regarding graft versus host disease and other hurdles that folks who get a bone marrow transplant are dealing with. So that targets a very specific audience. That's been a great resource for patients in that world. And the Detroit City of Design podcast is a partnership with the College for Creative Studies, talking about Detroit as designated as a UNESCO City of Design, only American city to get that designation. And that has been hugely successful for them because they've leveraged their existing marketing channels and promoted the podcast. So the why is really important. Who's hosting your show? Who are your guests going to be? Who are you targeting? Who am I speaking to, and why do they want this? These are all questions to think about before you launch a podcast. The what? What's it about? The show itself and each individual episode. One of my early mentors in radio told me that a radio show, or in this case a podcast, is like driving a NASCAR. And full disclosure, I have zero interest in NASCAR, but the idea is you do all your work in the pit so that when the race starts, all you've got to do is drive the car. You map out your show, you plan it out, so once you hit record, you know exactly where you're going and how you're going to get there. The when are you going to record? How often are you going to record? Are you going to do once a month? Are you going to release every other Tuesday? Are you going to release on the 15th of every month? The one in caps here is really important. The biggest hurdle is just doing it, just actually doing it and getting started. You can have all the best plans, but you actually have to do it. And when does it end? For my clients, I sign them up to a season, a finite number of episodes, 3 episodes, 5 episodes, 10 episodes, whatever it is. Because if it becomes this nebulous, hey, I'm going to do this every week forever, it just becomes one other thing on your to-do list. So pod fading is the industry term. About 3/4 of the podcasts in Apple don't have any new content in the last couple months because they did it, it was fun, and then they kind of forgot about it. So for my clients, I say, let's do a finite number and then reevaluate and see if you want to continue. So start with a finite number so it doesn't become this burden on top of the 8 million other things you have to do every other day. Where? Normally, I would say in person to record, but obviously in this age, things have been different. I record remotely with all my clients right now. So Zoom and Skype and Ringer, those are all great for conference calls like this. They are terrible for podcasts. Without getting too technical, Zoom has a lower recording rate, a lower quality rate, so that the audio is going to be degraded and also loses some frequency in the voice. You may have heard a Zoom call where people don't sound quite natural or sound a little bit robotic. It's not a good idea to use that to record for podcasts. Other things you can use are products like Zencastr, Squadcast, and I can give you more information on this offline if you're interested, or a double ender. What a double ender is you're talking to somebody and you're recording yourself locally. So we might be on Zoom, but I'm recording myself on, GarageBand or QuickTime or some sort of app, so that all I need to do is send my audio to the host when I'm done, and they can line up their audio and the guest's audio as 2 separate files and edit it that way. If you're recording locally, you don't have that internet issue with buffering and things like that. Podcast metrics, this is really cool because you can see how your show is doing. You can get some really good data on it. These are just some examples. So here is a show that I'm working on where they've got 2,000 total downloads. They got 3 today, 110 over the last week, 330 330 the previous 7 days, and how many unique listeners among that. It can rank the number of your episodes. This is a financial advisor that I work with. Here are their top episodes in terms of how many downloads they got. You can see which episodes are popular to maybe get some feedback on what topics are working well with your audience. And even tells you how people are listening. As I said, Apple Podcasts is still the dominant. And for this, Simplecast, which is the host they use, that's the web player. So they're listening on the web, they're listening on Apple, and then you can see iTunes, Google Podcasts, and other things as you go down. Number one question I get from clients: how long should my show be? And the answer is it depends. My show, for example, I do a 5-minute show on Fridays and a 30-minute interview on Tuesdays. As long as the content is good, keep going. There are shows, Joe Rogan is 2 hours. Pod Safe America that I enjoy listening to is an hour and a half, an hour, 45 minutes. Shorter is better. Don't stretch to hit some artificial, I'm only at 25 minutes. I've got to fill for the next 5. Don't do that. When you're done, you're done. It's not a TV show or a radio show. When you're done, hit stop, and that's it. I had a client that was planning on recording a 30-minute interview. after 15 minutes, they'd covered all the content. She looked at me and said, "Now what?" I said, "Now we stop. This episode is going to be 15 minutes and not 30 minutes because everything was really good. And there's no reason to try to fill to get to some sort of artificial number." Aretha said it best, RESPECT. Your audience is making commitment to listen to your podcast. So don't waste their time. Their time is valuable just like anybody else's. So you've probably heard shows that start with, "Hey, how you doing today? Great weather we're having. So I just tried this great new diner down the street, and man, I had the best bacon and eggs this morning." Get to it. Get to the content. Also, don't have poor quality audio or inconsistent volume. You've probably heard a podcast. You've been listening in the car where you've got to turn the volume knob up and down because one person is way louder than the other. It becomes a frustrating listening experience. People aren't going to come back. And I think that maybe I think that everybody uses those crutch words in conversation. Try to keep them to a minimum or hire an editor like me that will edit them out in post-production. And as the cliche goes, fix it in post. So you can all see what this is. It's a plug. Finally, my business. I provide an A to Z solution for podcast creators. I can help you conceptualize and create it. You can record on-site or virtually. On-site, of course, depending as things open back up. I'll produce it, I'll edit it, add music or professional voiceover to the beginning or end if need be, set you up on a host. And a quick note on that, there's 2 steps to getting your podcast on the podcast apps. You need, just like a website, you need it to be hosted somewhere that hosts, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because that's the end of my presentation. But there's a podcast host where your audio lives for, $15 a month is generally where they start, 1.5 and go up from there. But to get on all the apps like Apple, Google, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, those are all free. They want the content. So you pay for the hosting, and then you connect your host to those apps so that once you record and edit and finalize an episode, you hit publish. Within a couple hours, the apps will pull in that content from your host, and you'll be on all the apps. So the apps are free. You only pay for the host like $15 or so a month. So I kind of blew through it quickly. When I present, sometimes I speak fast. I apologize because I grew up in the Northeast. Sometimes I speak quickly, but I do want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that any of you have about podcasting.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of equipment do you recommend for people just starting a podcast? I see you've got headphones, you've got like sound proofing walls, you've got, a big microphone. If someone wants
you mean this microphone right here?
Yeah. Yeah. So if someone, like my 12-year-old daughter wanted to start a podcast, what kind of equipment would they need to get started, or would you recommend?
Great question. And as I trimmed this presentation down, that was one of the slides I cut, and now I shouldn't have cut it. So you can, if you have an unlimited budget, you can buy this $400 microphone in front of me. Not everybody needs that. To sound very good and sound professional, you can generally get a microphone for between $50 and $100. You can get it, and I'll give you a couple models here if you want to write them down. You can get them on Amazon, Best Buy, any place like that. Guitar Center. The 2 microphones that I recommend for most of my clients, and what's great about them is there's 2 options for connection. There's a USB connection, and then there's what they call an XLR connection, which is that 3-prong mic cord that can go into a more professional recorder, but it comes with both. The 2 that I recommend, the first one is made by a company called Samson, Samson, and the model is Q2U, Samson Q2U. That's a great microphone that's probably going to run you about $60 or $70, a Samson Q2U. And the other one is made by a company called Audio Technica, Technica, and it is called, that model is the ATR, as in Audio Technica, 2100X. That one will run you about $100. They both sound really good. They both sound professional. The only other accessory you'll need for it is, I'd recommend one of those little windscreens. That's that foam pad that goes over a microphone that'll cut down on the breaths in and out of it. Those are a couple bucks. If you're online buying the mic, you can add on that for a couple of bucks. But generally, for a microphone to record, as you're starting out, $50 or $100 will get you where you need to go. So great question, Kelly. Thank you.
Yeah. So you plug that into your laptop, your computer.
Yep.
record to your host, and then you can upload it, edit it. Do you use certain editing software for your podcasting, or?
Yep, there's a bunch of them. Some of them are free. So if you are on Apple, if you're on a Mac, you can use GarageBand. You can use QuickTime. If you're on Windows, there is a free program called Audacity, just like it sounds, just like I have the audacity to be giving this presentation this morning. The program is called Audacity, and that is a free editing software that covers most of the basic stuff you need. What I personally edit on is something called Adobe Audition. It's part of the Adobe Creative Suite that has, Photoshop and things like that. That is a monthly fee of, I believe, $20 or $25 a month. That's my preferred platform, but it's my preferred platform because it's the software I used in my 15-year radio career. So the cliche goes, the best DAW, D-A-W, digital audio workstation, is the one you're most comfortable with. So find what, they all have different bells and whistles. Some are higher end than others. Really, it's a matter of finding something that you learn and that you're comfortable with. I could find 10 podcast editors and they probably use 10 different software applications. But yeah, those mics will plug right into your USB on your computer and you can record and go from there.
John, can you repeat the Audio Technica? Was it ATR and then what were the numbers after it?
2100X.
Okay.
They had, the old model was the ATR 2100. They, a couple months ago, discontinued it and upgraded it to the 2100X, which is a slightly higher end microphone. So it went from $70 to about $100.
John, how important are the egg cartons for sound baffling?
Not very. Because this is my full-time job, I've obviously invested a lot in my business. Those microphones that I recommended, as long as you are in a room that doesn't have a lot of echo, doesn't have a lot of high ceilings, doesn't have a lot of hard surfaces, like porcelain in a bathroom, for example, or a kitchen, those mics will make you sound pretty good. Most of my clients, I send them that microphone and they're in their office or in their home office when they're recording with me. Obviously you don't want to have a lot of noise around you, like a fan or a fridge or a dishwasher or things like that. But those mics are pretty good about not picking up all the background noise around you. You obviously want to be a little bit closer to it. You want to be ideally probably 3 or 4 inches from the microphone as you're speaking. Try not to drift away too much. I'll actually show you something here since we're running a little bit early. Microphones have what's known as a proximity effect. So obviously the further I get away from the microphone, the quieter I get. But the other piece of it is the low end and the bass in your voice will also disappear the further you pull away from your microphone. So if I get right up on my microphone, you can hear that there's more low end and there's more bass in my voice. But as I back away just a few inches, not only do I get quieter, but the bass disappears from my voice as well. So that's true of a lot of microphones. It's what's known as proximity effect. And it actually is, if you can stay fairly consistently close to your microphone, it'll make a big difference in your sound. The first thing that I always tell clients while I'm recording with them is be comfortable. So if you've got notes you're looking at or reading as you're recording your podcast, you don't want to get in a position where you have to get right up on your microphone and you're at an awkward angle to try to read your notes or anything like that. So first of all, be comfortable. Get in a spot where you feel comfortable, then worry about mic placement. A lot of great places in your home to record are our living room, maybe on a couch where there's a lot of cushions that will absorb the sound waves. Some people, if they have a walk-in closet, will do it in there because all those hanging clothes absorb the sound waves as well and avoid cut down on echo. Walk-in closet or not closet. Sometimes people will just sit on the floor of their closet with a microphone plugged into a laptop, and that works for them. So there are a lot of ways, especially with the technology, with the microphones and remote recording software, to really sound professional without much expense or much effort. And if you make it sound professional, you're already going to be ahead of 80% of the podcasts on Apple, because I can't tell you how many times, I'm sure you have all heard a podcast where it's somebody yelling into their phone from like 10 feet away and here's my podcast and look at me. It's really not hard to sound good. And if you sound good, if you have good audio quality and you don't waste a listener's time with a lot of banter as you get into the show, you're already ahead of 80-90% of the other podcasts out there.
What about the importance of headphones?
It depends on exactly how you're recording. So if it's just you solo and you don't feel the need to hear your own voice as you're recording, you don't need them. if you are recording remotely with somebody, for example, us here, some software programs will have a built-in thing to cancel out the echo so that your microphone isn't picking up what's coming out of it, but some of them don't. So you run the risk of your microphone picking up your guest as they come out of your computer speaker. That said, yes, you can buy studio quality headphones, or you can just use the headphones that come with your iPhone, as long as they've got that standard headphone jack like you would plug into a Walkman back in the day that was in your computer. That those mics I recommend that also have a headphone jack in them. So you can plug the headphones in. You don't need high-end headphones. You can get headphones from the dollar store even. It's not a big investment, but I do recommend them. It'll definitely improve your quality.
Great.
I have been listening to a certain podcast for a couple of years now, and they just moved locations. And so they were filming with blankets hung up on their walls and over moving boxes and things to help deaden the sound from the echo. And it was funny, they were posting some behind the scenes photos. So they were using what they had, blankets.
Yeah, that works. That's a really common thing, actually, Kelly, where people will hang blankets, they'll hang, or they'll be in a carpeted room is obviously better than a hardwood floor because that dampens the sound a little bit as well. But again, as long as you don't have any, big, what we call reflective surfaces, like a flat metal surface or something where you can hear the echo of your voice in a room, or giant vaulted ceilings or anything like that, it's pretty easy to sound professional.
John, I got a question.
Mm-hmm.
If I understood right, you mentioned about paying a hosting, which would be something around like $15 per month. That would be in case I want to put my podcast on the different apps. But if I want to to use that Audacity program for Windows and buy my own microphone, so I will be only able to put my podcast either on my website or on media, Facebook and stuff. And that is the main difference.
Yes, yes and no. Oh, you're welcome, Cheryl. Goodbye. I'll try to explain this without getting too technical, because the technical side of it sometimes confuses me too. So you can, if you want to record your audio and just post the audio on your website, you can certainly do that. If you want to get on the podcast apps where most people do their podcast listening, the host will generate what's known as an RSS feed. It's a URL, it's a link. In order to generate that feed, your host will need at least one piece of audio, which is why a lot of podcasts will do a trailer before they start. And that can be 1 or 2 minutes. Hey, here's what our podcast is going to be about. And podcast artwork. And while you guys are taking notes, I'll mention the artwork. Apple has specifications for what the logo or artwork of your podcast needs to be. And that is that it needs to be square and not rectangular. So height has to match width. And a minimum of 1400 by 1400 pixels and a maximum of 3000 by 3000 pixels. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, if you have now have a host and you have now submitted your audio and your logo to the host will then generate that link, that RSS feed URL. When you connect your host to Apple, Spotify, Google, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Stitcher, whatever podcast apps you want, the way you do that is you submit that RSS URL to the apps. So what the apps will then do is they will pull your content from that feed. That URL has all your podcast information in it, that link. So that that RSS feed, the apps will pull them all in. So once you have your host set up, say for example, I post an episode of my show at noon today. Within an hour or two, it'll pop up on Apple and Spotify and everywhere else, because those apps have checked my feed, seen that there's a new episode in there, and pulled that episode down into their app from the feed, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I explained that well, but let me know if I didn't.
Or yeah. And when you said it's better to do have like a number of episodes, like 5, 6, whatever, not forever. So if you are paying this host Obviously, that should be paid in a monthly basis or or yearly. But if you are just gonna use like seasons, how does it work?
So you pay the host as long as you want your audio on there. So again, say $15 a month. Simplecast.com is my preferred host, and I can connect with any of you offline and get you set up on that. And Simplecast plans start at $15 a month. So whether you have one episode on there or 100 episodes on there, you pay that $15 a month to Simplecast to keep the content there as long as you want it on there. The beauty of podcasts are sometimes the content can be what we call evergreen. So if you, for example, I worked with a divorce attorney and she did a quick 3-episode season about the ins and outs of divorce. That content is evergreen. That content is relevant to somebody getting divorced today or somebody getting divorced a year from now. She can, even if she's not creating new content, that content can live forever on the host and all the apps. And she can share a link to the episode whenever she wants. She could share an episode that's 6 months old if the content is still relevant. So that $15 a month is just to keep the audio living, so to speak, on that platform for as long as you want it.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So John, I mean, I understand, you know, when you said, what's the why, you know, are you passionate about what you're doing? Is it a marketing tool? So do successful podcasts make money?
Yes. Not and here's an interesting way to put it, because that is a very common question that I get. Thank you for asking that. Some of the bigger ones do. And yes, the top, you know, that end up having, you know, ZipRecruiter or Sleep Number Beds or any of those that those national, they have, you know, probably hundreds of thousands of downloads. There are a couple different ways I look at this. Is your goal to do a podcast should not be to make money out of the bat. Chances are you're really going to need to be doing it for at least a good year before you start to make any money off of it. And there are a couple different ways to look at this. If you have a niche for your podcast, I always use the old college class cliche of basket weaving. Say you really are into basket weaving and you love basket weaving. Well, you're probably not going to have 1 million downloads for a basket weaving podcast, but the 100 people that are listening to you are probably really into basket weaving. And I bet you that there's a basket company that really wants to get in front of those 100 people that care that much about basket weaving. So, so you can make money from a sponsor if there's a niche podcast that you have. And then also if you have a built-in following. So for example, that Mistress Carrie with the purple hair in the graphic that I showed a little while ago, she's a Boston radio DJ that I grew up listening to. And her podcast, her radio station recently went off the air and she started a podcast. She had built such a following as a radio DJ for 25 years. She had sponsors out of the gate because she just leveraged her existing social media following and things like that. So she's set for life, not set for life, but she's really in good shape because she had people that said, oh, you're doing a podcast, I want to sponsor it, because she had such a big reach. The real key to doing a podcast, the goal should be brand awareness and using it as a marketing tool for your business. And that's what I specialize in with branded podcasts. And I'll give you an example of my own podcast. So I don't have 1 million downloads on my podcast. I might have 100 downloads every episode if I'm lucky for a really good one. That said, I share on my social media every time I do a new episode. And at the risk of sounding like Seinfeld, I have a podcast about podcasting. So my podcast is about podcasts. So I share all these episodes and little video clips of the episodes, or it's audio, but it's got a picture on it. So Facebook's algorithm thinks it's video. I share these on my social media. And I had somebody on my Facebook, a Facebook friend that I hadn't talked to in 10 years, reach out to me and say, hey, I'm working at an ad agency and I have a company that wants to do a podcast. Can I connect you with them? Absolutely. And it turned into a lead for a client because I was marketing myself in the space as a podcast person. So whatever your topic is or whatever your business is, it's one way to market your business. And you can sort of close that loop where in the end of the podcast, you can come out and say, hey, if you're more interested in our business, here's how to call me, here's our email, here's our website, here's our social media, etc. And then on all of your social media and other marketing channels, email, e-blast, whatever it is, you can promote the podcast. So you can sort of make it one big circle. But marketing and a branding tool are really, should be the primary goal if you're doing a podcast related to your business. But if you're doing it just for fun because you want to do a podcast and there's something passionate you want to talk about, enjoy the craft of it. And then if you're passionate about it and find the right people and connect with the right people, maybe the advertising comes later, but it shouldn't be your top priority out of the gate.
What's the name of your podcast about podcasting?
So my radio DJ name was Jag. That's the name of my company, Jag in Detroit. So the name of the podcast is The Jag Show.
I have a question about episodes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'll use Netflix as an example.
Sure.
So sometimes you get on to Netflix or Amazon Prime and it's week to week to week. So you can't watch all the episodes at one time. And other times they throw the whole season up there. Do you have a recommendation about that at all?
I don't. That's a great question. It really depends on your goal for the podcast. So, for example, the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link podcast that I work on, they choose to release seasons at a time. So we'll do, say, a 6 or an 8 episode season. We'll record all the interviews. We'll edit them. We'll get everything we want, and we'll publish them all in a certain order. And you can, to use your Netflix analogy, binge them as you want to listen to them. There are some who create and crank out content weekly. So my Jag Show podcast, the way I set it up is every Friday I do a 5-minute podcast about what happened in the world of podcasting that week, just 5 minutes of podcasting news or something that I learned myself as a podcaster or working with other podcast hosts. And then on Tuesdays, I release a 30-minute interview with somebody in the podcasting space, somebody that's done something cool or relevant in the podcasting space. So I'm working on that content weekly. And I'm cranking it out weekly. There are some folks who come out with it weekly and want to work ahead in case, their to-do list gets too long and they can't record that week, where they'll have 2 or 3 episodes in the bank and ready to release them, and they're working 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time. It can be difficult with the news changing so quickly now to be relevant if it's a newsworthy podcast. But that said, sometimes people have episodes ready to go. My Tuesday episode came out yesterday. I'm already editing my podcast for next Tuesday. So I already have that interview done, and I'm trying to work a week or 2 out so that I'm not all of a sudden trying to find a guest and I'm up against the clock and out of time. So.
Thank you.
I've noticed on the more popular podcasts I listen to, there is some sort of a formula to it. So if you're interested in starting a podcast, do you recommend people go and listen to the popular ones and say, there's like a welcome, maybe a tiny bit of banter. Some of them do have longer ads than others, where I'm guilty of skipping through the ad content to get to the presentation or the speaker content. So I don't know. Do you recommend people maybe listen to some podcasts, pick some that they like, and try and mimic that formula that they use?
That's a great question, Kelly. And because in some ways it is such a new medium, there's a little bit of a wild, wild west mentality to it, where there are a million different ways to skin a cat, so to speak. How many cliches can I get into one webinar? Okay. So everybody does it differently. Find a show that you like, and you might want to emulate that. So I come back to Joe Rogan. I'm not a regular listener of his podcast, but he's been in the news a lot lately and is regarded as one of, if not the most successful podcasts out there. And again, 100 million reasons why. Spotify is what they gave him for money. Last time I listened to his show, like to your point, Kelly, it was like 7 minutes of ads at the beginning of the show. And I'm like, skip. And to me, that's just silly, because those advertisers are not getting any bang for their buck, because I can't imagine how many people are skipping it. Again, Mistress Carrie, the radio DJ that I worked with, she started with about 2 minutes of ads. And my initial thought was, no, don't do that. But it works for Joe Rogan, and he's laughing all the way to the bank. So it's really a matter of taste and style. I will say this for podcasts, and this comes to my background in radio, the old radio live endorsement model of the DJ or the host talking about the product. I think that is much more effective than a pre-recorded, hey, go buy a car from XYZ Chevrolet or whatever it is. I think because you are creating a bond with your listener as the host, your word carries more weight. I think of, like, for example, when I worked at Channel 955, a recorded commercial versus Mojo coming on and saying, hey, I got my car at this dealership. That carries a lot more weight. because you are creating a bond with your listeners, just the way a radio morning show would, whether you're Mojo or Paul W. Smith or Dave and Chuck or whoever your morning show host of choice, Drew and Mike of choice is over the years here in Detroit. You're creating that same bond. So I do recommend doing a live read, so to speak, an endorsement as the host, as opposed to some pre-recorded ad. And I think there is a tolerance for podcast listeners built into for ads, because they understand that if you're making money, you're probably making it off of ads, that it's ad supported. So if you weave the fabric of the ad into the show, it's a lot more listenable and less likely to get skipped. So for example, I'll go back to Pod Save America, which is, if you're not familiar, it's a political podcast. It's several former Obama staffers giving their commentary on what's going on now. So you can imagine they have some pretty strong opinions about that stuff. And they kind of joke around during the show. They'll joke in the middle of their show. They'll talk about ZipRecruiter or whoever the ad is. And again, I'm not going to get political here, but I'm just going to quote them. But they might say, "Are you Donald Trump? Are you having trouble filling all the positions in your cabinet? You should try ZipRecruiter." But the idea is they're doing it in their own personality and their own style, and they're making it part of the show, as opposed to taking a piece of paper and saying, "ZipRecruiter is the #1 leading job website, and you should get one-click apply." And it doesn't sound natural that way. So if you can, if you're doing, again, the basket weaving podcast, and you're saying, you know what, hey, thanks to our sponsor, Joe Schmo Baskets. I've really enjoyed their product. They sent it to me. I use it when I use it in my, I don't know anything about basket weaving. I use it in my basket weaving. If you make it part of the show and in your voice, it'll be a lot more effective. And somebody's a lot less likely, to your point, Kelly, to skip right through it and hit that 30 seconds button and skip right through it.
Yeah, as a listener, I found the ads to be most effective to be ones where it's almost like a testimonial wrapped into an endorsement. Like, we've used this, we love it.
Yes.
You can get 15% off if you mention our podcast or whatever. So, and they're brief and they're succinct. So as a listener, that's what I prefer. But
I prefer that too. The Jag Show is sponsored by this company. They're also sponsored by this company and this company and this company for the first 5 minutes of the show, because I'm almost always going to skip that. But that's just my personal opinion. Not everybody does.
Any more questions?
John, so if someone was to call you, not knowing if a podcast is right for them, like, do you do consulting in that
Absolutely.
regard?
Always happy to have a conversation. My phone number is 313, that slide was up at the end of it, 313-757-2524, which actually comes out to 7572-JAG, which is a Google number that I set up when I was on the air. So 313-757-2524. I'm always happy to have a conversation and go from there. My email is JAG, J-A-G, @jagindetroit.com. You can send me an email there. I also have an online calendar that you can book a 15 or 30-minute conversation. That is absolutely free of charge. And that is on the website called Calendly. So it's CALENDLY, not calendar, but Calendly.com/JAG-in-Detroit. Calendly.com/JAG-in-Detroit. You can go online and even book a 15 or 30-minute conversation with me right from my calendar. But updates in real time with my calendars. I have a lot of clients that book recording times simultaneously. So I found this to be the easiest way so I don't get double booked without realizing it.
All right. Any other additional questions from anybody? I think this was great dialogue and really wonderful information, John. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
No, thank you guys for having me, and thank you for all the great questions. I could talk about this as the day is long. So, and thank you for the clap too.
You're very knowledgeable. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Much appreciated. Everybody have a great day. Take care.
Thank you. We will be sharing this on our website if anyone wants to refer back to it. So let us know if you have any questions. We will all see you soon, hopefully. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you guys. Bye.